Good day everyone, this is Marjorie Pinky and Son, and this video contains the continuation of the discussion started by Miss Arvida and Miss Elisan about metrics and versification. Before we proceed, let us have a short recap of what Miss Arvida and Miss Elisan had discussed. In the previous report of Miss Arvida, we learned that understanding meters in poetry is much like understanding the beats in a song. By definition, meter is a literary device that works as a structural element in poetry. And essentially, meter is the basic rhythmic structure of a line within a poem or a poetic work. In a spoken language, words are made up of syllables that are either stressed or unstressed, by which we mean parts of the word which are either stronger and more forceful or stressed, or lighter and less labored or unstressed. Metrics, then, is a fancy way of talking about the combinations of stressed and unstressed syllables within a poem. And the broader term for this is prosody, which refers to the other structural elements as well as metrics such as rhyme. On the other hand, versifications. We learned in Miss Elisa's discussion that versification, we are somehow generally discussing technical characteristics and mechanical facts. Versification, therefore, is the study and analysis of the basis framework that makes up the structure of the verse. And the most important of these technical attributes is meter. The presence of meter is fundamental as it creates the sounds and sense of the verse. Metrical rhythms are composed of stressed and unstressed syllables, as I've said a while ago, and meter is a result of the pattern of the stressed and unstressed syllables that recurs throughout the verse. Composing metrical verse means making a certain pattern of meter recur and fixing the number of these recurring units in each line. And we learned that there are 5 most common types of metrical feet encountered in verse. And these are the iambic foot, the anapestic foot, the trochaic foot, the dactylic foot, the spondaic foot. And that's for our short recap for today. And let's continue the discussion, and today I am tasked to discuss the poetic form. There are 3 main groups of poetic form. First is the lyrical form, second is the narrative form, and the third is the didactic form. Let's discuss it one by one. Lyrical form. The term lyric comes from ancient Greece. Originally, it was a verse where a single voice accompanied by the lyre, and while our definition of the word has been extended, the ideas of music and single voice still distinguish the lyric from other forms of poetry. And there are identifying features of a lyric, and these are the following. First is the poem, suitable for singing or being accompanied by music. Second is a subjective work, speaking of personal thoughts and feelings. Third is usually it is the development of a single thought or emotion. Fourth, it is usually relatively short. Fifth, lyrics are very often dramatic. And lastly, they generally follow a structure. First, the experience, stimulus or motive, then thoughts arising to the motive, then provide the body of the work, followed by an adjustment or decision, and ending with a reflective intellectual conclusion. And there are 5 main forms of lyrical poetry. First is the song lyric. It is written specifically to be sung. Second is the sonnet. It is a form of the song lyric. As we all know, sonnet, it was developed in Italy during the Renaissance, and it was imitated then developed by English writers. Third is the ode. It is a dignified and a lofty lyrical poem, not intensely personal and often longer than most of other kinds of lyrics. And the fourth is the elegy. It is a lyric which is sad and wistful and expression of mourning for those who have departed, and is very often a lament for the dead. And lastly is the ideal. It is originally Greek word for a little picture, usually refers to scenes of the blissful charm of rural life, romantically viewed, and etc. Let's talk about the second type of poetic form. It is the narrative form. From the word itself, narrate. It simply means the poetic form that is used for telling of a story or an incident. And the author needs to develop a plot, characterization, background, and atmosphere. And did you know that there are also 5 main forms of narrative verse? Let's find out. Yes, there are 5 main forms of narrative verse. First is the ballad. The ballad is a story song about folk culture and often of anonymous or collective authorship. Literary ballads are an imitation of the original and usually written by a single author. Ballads aren't nearly as popular in the 21st century, but some great 19th century ballads include The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and the second one is The Ballad of Reading Gaol by Oscar Wilde. The third type of narrative verse is the idyll. The word idyllic describes something reminiscent of rural and pastoral life. Idyll poems, thus, are narrative poems which celebrate, describe, and explore rustic life. Idyllic poetry is typically short, but it still builds a narrative, and often a group of idylls will be stringed together to form a larger story. For example, the 12 idylls together from Tennyson's Idylls of the King, which retells the story of the King Arthur, his love for Guinevere, and the story of his kingdom. The next in line is the epic. It is a long narrative poem that usually recounts stories of heroism, where the protagonists of epic poems are often kings, knights, heroes, or else extraordinary people who change the fate of their history. In ancient times, epic poetry primarily dealt with the gods, as I've said a while ago, with war or with other events which define a people's nationality. The famous Mahabharata, for example, it tells the story of 2 groups of cousins fighting against each other to determine the successors of the Hastinapura throne. Through these epics, it is interwoven through the story are tales of morality, national identity, and the gods, culminating in a sprawling epic which, until to this day, influences certain aspects of Indian culture. Other examples are Beowulf, the Aeneid and the Odyssey, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Shahnameh, and among others. Next in line, we have the dramatic poetry, a play in which the author uses a verse, and the good dramatic poetry uses iambic pentameter and works best when it is read aloud. Next in line, we have the lay. It is somewhat long narrative that, like other forms of poetry, evolved through several centuries. The earliest record lay poems were written by Marie de France, a French woman, and lays were often stories of romance, chivalry, and emotional experiences. Lay poetry was typically written in octosyllabic verse, meaning each line had 8 syllables. The contemporary tales includes instances or examples of lay, namely the Franklin's Tale, which explores issues of truth and magnanimity. Last but not the least is the novel in verse. Among the contemporary narrative poems, the novel in verse rules is exactly what it sounds like, a novel-length story told lines of poetry, not prose. It is a novel in verse that is largely experimental, where there are no solid rules for how to write one. However, many verse novels tend to have a first-person narrators, short chapters, and non-linear storytelling. Some examples of these long narrative poems include Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson, The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, Omeros by David Walcott, Inside Out and Back Again by Tanha Lai, and Dreaming of You by Melissa Lozada Oliva. And moving on to the last type of poetic form, which is the didactic form. Didactic denotes a purpose of teaching or preaching. Broadly speaking, most literature is didactic in as much as it has something to say. However, in this particular form, the primary focus or the primary purpose is to instruct the reader or persuade him to a point of view. So it means it has to do with teaching something. And this can take the form of very specific instructions such as how to catch a fish, as in James Thomson's The Seasons, or how to write a good poetry, as in Alexander Pope's essay on criticism. But it can also be meant as instructive in a general way. And there are two main types of didactic poetry. First is the discursive poetry. Pope's essay on man is a good example. The Pope uses the heroic couplet to set out a general philosophy of life, and some critics prefer to regard this kind of poetry as a verse. Second one is the satire. It is a form of criticism by ridicule, caricature, and similar devices. Once again, some claim that these works may be great verse but not poetry. And to sum it up, often poetry will be a blend of lyrical, narrative, and didactic offering by many subtypes in poetic form. And a lyric form is a comparatively short, non-narrative poem in which a single speaker presents a state of mind or an emotional state. That is lyrical poem. Second is the narrative poetry. It gives a verbal representations in verse of a sequence of connected events. It propels character through a plot, and the purpose of this is to narrate a story. And the third one is the didactic poem. The purpose of a didactic poem is primarily to teach or to preach. And I hope you learned something for today. That's all for now. Thank you for listening. Once again, this is Marjorie Pinky Johnson. God bless.